The fourth and final theme of our Wānanga is whakawhiti engage. He waka ike noa, a canoe which we are in, working together as one. Our Wānanga in Te Whanganui-a-Tara is the opportunity to bring landscape architecture to the forefront of decision making, as this is critical as to how we respond and innovate as a profession through landscape planning, management and design. This theme is focused on what are the big areas impacting progress and how can landscape architecture be part of that solution. With conflicting policies and no simple answers, how do we create an environment that allows the profession to reach its full potential through the engagement with decision-making, policy, community, and action plans? First up in this session, I'm thrilled to welcome Mr. Simon Upton, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. Urban spaces and the soil beneath are essential to city infrastructure and as important as pipes and roads. Commissioner will share recommendations from 2 recent reports on how we can better protect and provide for these resources. Please welcome Simon Upton.
Tēnā koutou katoa, thank you for the welcome. I'm going to talk to you about green space. My interest in green space was sparked a few years ago. During my commute on the motorway between my home and Hamilton Airport, I regularly pass the new suburb of Rototuna, which is rapidly growing on the northern edge of the city. I took this photo. Now, while the image is striking, it wasn't the aesthetic element that concerned me the most, because of course it's all covered in nice houses with black roofs and concrete driveways now. Instead, I started to question how this suburb will cope with the effects of climate change, when from the very start it has been stripped of trees and soil. That question led me to an investigation into what's happening to urban green space, which was released last year. Now, at the time, much of the concern around losing green space and trees revolved around recreational opportunities and amenity. Any proposal to sell and redevelop a public park, for example, would typically be justified by an assertion that no one's using it. That same proposal would often be met by appeals to a loss of neighbourhood amenity. Now, those things are important. But believe it or not, only a few people, many of whom I suspect are in this room, were really thinking about the broader set of environmental services that green spaces, parks, lawns, berms, trees, wetlands, private backyards provide to city dwellers. Things like stormwater absorption, temperature regulation, air filtration, and carbon sequestration. Now, the Auckland anniversary floods changed all of that. It was a clear demonstration of how harder, less spongy cities respond to extreme weather events. Many built-up areas in West Auckland and the North Shore were simply overwhelmed by this unprecedented event. These images taken from my Urban Green Space report show how much of a difference street trees can make to heat. So water's one issue, heat's another. The image on the, I seem to have turned 2 pages at once. Must be what's happened. Here's me trying to stick exactly to a speech. Here we are, yes. However, those areas that you saw, and I'll just go back, if I can, yes, there we are, fared better. Other areas fared better thanks to the capacity of their green spaces to absorb and retain some rainfall. Now, there's no doubt that harder cities are less resilient to extreme weather events. Research by Wellington Water found that where there's an impervious surface covering more than 65% of an urban area, the peak rate of overland rain runoff is almost triple that from urban green spaces. Sealing the ground with impervious surfaces not only increases peak rates, but also increases the frequency of runoff occurring, as it will occur after smaller events too. Now, extreme rainfall events are just the first cab off the climate change rank. It's very likely that our cities will also experience more frequent heat waves in the coming decades. I think Kiwis have got the water thing in their mind because of these sorts of images. The heat one is yet to come. But as Australian cities have known for some time, green space can help to mitigate the effects of excessive heat. there's an emerging international evidence base describing the size of the cooling effect provided by green space. But surprisingly, there's been almost no research in this country on the size of this service. So in the report, we relied on some infrared photography. This image illustrates the dramatic impact that large parks can have on temperature. It's produced from satellite infrared data and shows variation in surface temperature across Auckland on a warm, sunny morning in December 2019. The colour bands range from 42 degrees in the red to 15 degrees in the blue, which is the sea. The cooler inner city areas correspond with outlined urban green spaces. Now, some recent research from the UK provides further evidence. It found that the average cooling effect of various types of green spaces ranged from a drop of -5 to -2.9. This is non-trivial when you are in a heat wave. It really is. Now, these images, taken from my Urban Green Spaces report, show how much of a difference street trees can make to heat. The image on the right, captured with an infrared camera, reveals the surface temperature on a sunny summer's afternoon on a tree-lined street in central Wellington, just down here actually on Lambton Quay, when the air temperature was 23 degrees. And you can see it's actually 20.3 in the shade and it's 47 in the direct sunlight. Now, I'm aware that I've been talking about urban green space and that urban green space comes in many forms, not least the trees and forests that some of you will be associated with in, if you're lucky, living in a place like Wellington where there's actually green belts and there's large amounts of trees. As part of our work, we looked at the ability of different kinds of green space to provide environmental services, so stormwater absorption and cooling, but also air filtration, carbon storage and habitat provision. The general conclusion is that larger and more diverse vegetation tends to be more beneficial. I mean, no surprises there, that's pretty intuitive. That's not to say that grass doesn't have its place, but its environmental services are much more limited than trees and bush. By the way, this graphic is seriously simplified. It doesn't show any difference between the water filtering benefits offered by lawns and trees. That's mainly because we were trying to squash a lot of data into a very simplistic figure, so just ignore that. Further, more granular analysis shows that trees rank more highly. Stormwater runoff measured using an US online calculator indicated that if the area of green space shrinks by 10%, then the annual runoff increases by 25%. But if the proportion covered in lawn or larger shrubs and trees were also to change from, say, a 50-50 split to one where lawns accounted for 2/3 of the green space, then the annual runoff would be higher still, at about 33% more. So for any given green space, more grass equals more runoff. In sum, the quality of green space matters. Now, we've still got a lot to learn about how urban green space contributes to stormwater regulation in the New Zealand context, which is why in my Urban Green Spaces report I called for some more local research on this issue. And these findings must be shared in a way that's useful for councils and other decision makers. Now, let me talk about how green space is changing. Given the importance of the services provided by green space, a question immediately arises about how it's changing. You don't have to look far to see that the way we develop urban land in this country has changed dramatically with potentially significant consequences for green space. For the Urban Green Spaces report, I commissioned Manaaki Whenua to take a closer look at these trends all the way back to the 1940s, and we decided to look at 3 cities: Auckland, Hamilton, and Greater Wellington. And if you're wondering why Christchurch isn't one of them, well, the post-earthquake changes were so marked that any trends were rendered meaningless. I won't dwell on the results here. My staff have presented them previously, and they're outlined in full in my report. But I want to make 2 points. The first is that we've been losing substantial amounts of green space in Auckland and Hamilton. Wellington's different. That's in large part due to topography. it's quite hard to spread into some places, but also because it has had to accommodate far less population growth than Auckland or Hamilton. There have also been ongoing efforts to provide new peri-urban parks as the city grows. I think Wellington's done pretty well. It's worth noting that the size of the green space decline shown in Auckland and Hamilton on this figure here are probably conservative, partly because the through-time analysis doesn't do a good job of capturing sealed driveways and off-street car parks, both of which have become more common in recent decades, but also because, importantly, this analysis concludes in 2017. So we're not capturing any of the development that has transpired since then. So you can be sure that those yellow and red lines are going lower. The second point relates to why we're losing green space. Much of the decline in Auckland and Hamilton is down to changes on private land, not public land. There are at least two main factors involved. The first is infill development. This has been widespread in some parts of our cities with 2- and 3-lot subdivisions and the driveways to serve them, resulting in a significant loss of existing yards and gardens. This slide shows how this process has played out in Epsom in Auckland between the 1940s and today, with the white areas representing buildings. And here's another example from Hamilton East, which some of you will know, and that black square is the common. It's a piece of public green space, which obviously hasn't changed. The second factor driving the loss of private green space is a change in how we do greenfield development. Consider these two images from Auckland. On the left, we have an area from Mount Roskill that was developed in the late 40s, early 50s. The houses tend to be around 100 to 120 square metres, and the sections are around 800 square metres. On the right, we have an area in flat bush, developed much more recently. The houses have grown to 250 square metres in size, roughly, and the sections have shrunk to 450 square metres. And here's another example. If I can get this thing to move, what's going on? From Hamilton and from Wellington. Now, as I mentioned, the through-time analysis I commissioned finishes in 2017, but I'm unaware of any similar analysis having been undertaken since my report was published. One of the key recommendations I've made is the need to adopt a standardised monitoring of green space in New Zealand cities. That was partially adopted as part of the previous government's resource management reform, but that's since been rolled back. I can't overstate the importance of monitoring. Without some knowledge of how green space is changing, how can you possibly say whether your spending on parks, trees and wetlands is making any difference in terms of the services they provide? Okay, I want to dedicate the remainder of my remarks to what I see as the big opportunities to green our cities. As those of you who work for local authorities will know, this is far from straightforward. How many people do work for local authorities here? Could you put your hands up just so I can see? Yeah, it's not that many, is it? The rest of us are all private entrepreneurs, are we? Consultants, experts. A range of barriers exist. And they vary depending on whether public or private land is in the crosshairs. Let me start with public land. As part of the research for my report, we surveyed a selection of Tier 1 councils to get a better sense of their existing endowment of parks and reserves, as well as how much land they've been acquiring for new parks and new reserves. The slide shows the results of that survey. We discovered that most councils are providing new parks and reserves at a significantly slower rate than in previous decades. Some councils appear to have only provided a few additional square metres for each new resident since 2016. Put simply, acquisition is not keeping pace with population growth. Now, I acknowledge that acquiring pre-existing urban land for new parks is expensive. While greater use could be made of development contributions, high urban land prices will ultimately remain a real barrier. So it therefore seems pragmatic to me to direct much of the focus towards already existing areas of public land. Parks offer a significant opportunity, but perhaps the biggest opportunity lies within the road corridor. This constitutes a large proportion of the overall urban area, between 15 to 20% in the case of most of our cities. It's a lot of land. Roads also offer a connectivity that parks simply cannot. Now, in my view, there's a real opportunity to plant more trees in existing grass berms. And in many cases, it can be done tomorrow and at relatively low cost. Now, I understand that conflicts with traditional underground infrastructure. That can be problematic. But the use of tree pits or trenches can help to mitigate that. And of course, species selection is critical. In my view, we need to be focusing much more on modestly sized, but still canopy shading deciduous trees. I can come back to that. Ultimately, though, most of the land within our cities is privately owned, and this has to be part of the conversation if we want a truly city-wide distribution of trees and nature. And that means thinking harder about considerations that developers and landowners face when making decisions about how to use their land. Let me start by emphasising the importance of protecting what we already have. Lawns and gardens, once sealed over or built on, are well nigh impossible to get back. Replacing trees is even more problematic. You need years or decades, even if you can replant the tree. Given the very real public benefits that green space and trees provide, that raises a question as to whether existing planning rules are stringent enough. In my view, they're not. I'd highlight two examples. The first relates to the medium density residential standards. As you may be aware, these include a requirement that landscaping cover at least 20% of the area of an individual section. Whoopee-doo. As shown in this chart, that's less than half of existing citywide averages in Auckland, Hamilton and Greater Wellington. However, the new government has made these standards optional for councils, so it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. The second example relates to tree protection rules. These have a long and convoluted history, which many of you will be more familiar with than I am. In short, though, provisions in the RMA continue to make it very difficult for councils to protect important or notable trees. As of early last year, only a few thousand of Auckland's trees benefited from formal legal protection. In Hamilton and Tauranga, the number was less than 500. Now, the Natural and Built Environment Act sought to address this issue by removing the requirement for councils to undertake a plan change every time a protection was considered worthy. That now is ancient history, and we're back in a situation where there's very little stopping the removal of those trees that provide the greatest environmental benefits to urban dwellers. I'm not one-sided on this. Under the old regime in Auckland, I saw trees that could not be cut down, which weren't worth a can of fish. I mean, you can go to extremes. I mean, we were protecting moth-eaten silver dollar gums, which were just an eyesore every way round, but they were over a certain height and age. So I'm not religious about this. You have to find something practical, something pragmatic. Now, while providing some greater legal protection for privately owned green space can be part of the solution, I think more could be done to encourage its provision. And one such opportunity relates to stormwater development contributions. These are levied on residential developments and used to help fund the provision of the new stormwater infrastructure required to service them in an urban redevelopment situation. Given the role that green space can play in reducing that stormwater runoff, it seems reasonable to reward developers who retain more of it with a lower development contribution. And that is exactly what Auckland Council does. In my view, it's an approach that could be adopted much more widely. Now, this image is of a residential project in Mount Wellington. The extensive on-site planting and comprehensive stormwater planning using a diversified network of 50 soak hole devices helped this development withstand the Auckland anniversary floods. A similar approach could be adopted for trees. Under the Resource Management Act, councils can charge financial contributions to help mitigate the adverse environmental effects of development. Again, that raises the question, why not reward developers who retain pre-existing trees with a lower financial contribution? I'm aware that Christchurch and Hamilton City Councils were proposing something very similar to this as part of the plan changes required to implement the medium density residential standards. And if anyone in the audience is familiar with this, I'd be interested to hear whether that's still happening and whether it's actually generating results. Overseas, green score systems are also used to encourage the provision of private green space. London's urban greening factor system evaluates the quality and quantity of urban greening, and it provides a greater level of credit to developments where the minimum soil volume is equivalent to at least 2/3 of the projected canopy area of the mature trees. Now, if you're wondering about this photo, it's a very important tree, which is in Parliament's grounds, and it was moved carefully to make way for development. They're building a building behind. This is an absolutely fascinating story behind this, because when I was a young MP in the 1980s, they moved the same tree. It was about 100 years old then, I think, and they flew Japanese tree surgeons out from Japan, because the Japanese are meticulous about all this, and they did all of this work, and they put Hessian bundle around the root ball, and then it was picked up and it was moved to this site here. Yeah, give it 30 years and we want to blitz that. And I thought, oh my God, that's just going to be knocked down. No one will know. To my amazement, they've moved it again. And it's worked. It's worked brilliantly. It's behind. My theory is the reason it worked so well is that the root ball had been pruned 30, 40 years ago. There's a lot of new growth, so it was actually able to feed itself. They tried to move a tree which is 20 years old, just further along, it died. It's really interesting. But you can actually save trees. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to do this with every tree, but I thought it was a really good example, and I wanted to show you because if it gives any of you ideas, that's absolutely great. Lastly, it's important that we don't forget about green space provision on land that has yet to become urban. Now, there's much debate about how our cities should grow, with many environmental benefits in going up and densifying existing suburbs, most notably the reduction in transport emissions. But I think population growth will require at least some urban expansion, and where that's the case, councils have a real opportunity to acquire land for future parks and reserves much earlier, and thereby avoid the barrier posed by urban land prices. This proactive purchasing can create cornerstone or green lung areas which can become a focal point for future development. Wellington's outer green belt is an example of how strategic planning over a long time frame can achieve this, and Auckland's Barry Curtis Park, which is pictured here, is a more recent example. If you wait till it's all been rezoned, it's unaffordable. You have to make strategic purchases well in advance. So the use of a strategic land acquisition fund created as part of the long-term planning process could be an important part of the solution. Now, much of what I've said so far relates to green space writ large. I want to close by offering a few specific thoughts about trees and the soil that they need. The first is the need for adequate volumes of topsoil and subsoil, which is even more important, in urban areas for trees. I've just published this report on soils entitled Urban Ground Truths, Valuing Soil and Subsoil in Urban Development. Quick, hands up if you have even heard of it. And now keep them up if you've read it. This is always exciting, yes. This investigation found that extensive and sometimes excessive soil disruption and removal frequently occurs during urban development. Most residential subdivision developments involve the extensive removal and compaction of soil to create flat, build-ready sites. Subsequent landscaping returns some of the soil to the site, but It's often just a thin couche, and the limited environmental services that can provide, just this over massively consolidated subsoil. As you'll know, if topsoil depth is limited and if subsoil is compacted, the sort of trees that you can hope to grow is going to be very, very restricted, in some cases so severely that only shrubs will succeed. In these cases, the environmental services provided by these green spaces will be limited, and options to retrofit green infrastructure will also be curtailed. Now, as part of my inquiry, Manaaki Whenua was commissioned to investigate soil specifications across 14 local authorities. It found that while some councils recommended soil depths adequate for tree roots or for the installation of future green infrastructure, others did not. Of particular concern were soil depth specifications for grass. The depth of topsoil to support grass, which makes up large swathes of green spaces in cities, can be relatively thin and therefore more vulnerable to drying out in a drought and then becoming waterlogged when it's wet. Councils also lacked guidance around subsoil depths. In practice, this means that often topsoil is placed over compacted fill, which in turn limits the capacity of this soil to support trees and filter stormwater. So one of my recommendations from this report is for national level guidance from the Minister to clarify specifications on the depth and quality of both topsoil and subsoil, with specific consideration to increasing minimum depths for topsoil underlying grass lawns. And yes, I understand that soils differ across the country. This isn't going to be the same in Christchurch as it is in Hamilton, for instance. I'd encourage you to take a look at this report. It's really short, okay? It's not a big deal, as it has some interesting findings on the current fate of urban soil and some suggestions about how we could conserve it better. Second point is the need to plant now. The size of the environmental services provided by trees is directly related to their size, and large trees take time to grow. If trees are to help cities weather the worst of climate change, we need to get planting. Finally, a word about winter shade. This is a slightly more personal view on things, you may disagree. But I think if we want to get communities and homeowners on side with urban reforestation projects, we need to convince them that their homes won't be cast in shade for large chunks of the winter. I think deciduous trees can play an important role here. With the possible, and that's not one obviously, with the possible exception of habitat, they provide all of the same environmental services as natives, but without the dense winter shade that accompanies something like a totara, for example, planted, I think, insanely in the main street of Hamilton, and that is going to grow into a much, much, much bigger tree. It's already looking unhappy, but that will be this permanent shading and permanent needle fall going on there. That's not going to be particularly popular with people who are affected by that. I think that options like oaks or planes or zelkova are all worthy of consideration. That's just taken where we took the photos of the street temperature in Lambton Quay. And in summer, that's very, very pleasant. But in winter, the light comes in. And I do think we need to think about the way people live their lives. To conclude, the cooling and stormwater management services provided by green space and trees in our cities will become increasingly important as we face the effects of climate change. For this reason, green spaces must be treated and prioritised as infrastructure by our city planners, as the services they provide now and will continue to provide in the future are just as essential as those provided by roads and pipes. Let me tell you, the law says that councils must provide as essential infrastructure pipes, concrete and stuff. It says they may provide reserves, trees, etc. But it's all infrastructure. It's all infrastructure. That's what we've got to get into to people's minds. Because if we want our cities of the future to be resilient, healthy and enjoyable places to live, then it's vital that trees, green spaces and urban forests are prioritised in future developments and redevelopments. And that's my half hour. Thank you.
All right, yes, thank you, Simon. So, yes, very hot on time constraints here. So there are 3 questions. that have come forward. I don't want to have to let you choose. Maybe I should just choose.
Shall I just give a quick...
Okay, yeah.
I'll just have a quick go. Well, the answer to the first one, yes, I've just said it. It's critical, that's easy. Did we manage to speak to many landscape architects in time at the OECD? No, I just lived in Paris, which is very, very built. Very, very built. The bits of urban greening they've done are very high quality, but you need to move out a bit to see the best of that stuff. But no, I didn't. I mean, just the way trees are used in urban Europe, it's centuries old. That's what I'm saying about deciduous trees. Although just around the corner from where we are in Paris, they've got, it's crackers. They've put a street and they've put Magnolia grandiflora down the middle of it. It's a North American tree, apart from anything else. But of course, and people are doing this all over New Zealand. I would ban Magnolia grandiflora from public spaces unless it's a park. I just cannot believe that people are planting them. Do ministers listen? I don't know. You'd need to ask them. And if you're not already familiar with it, I'd highly recommend taking a look at the is that Christchurch City Council? Yeah, exactly. It was at an urban forest conference that I gave the speech. And I almost declined because I said, but they'll have all heard it. No, they said there's only an overlap of 6 people between this conference and that one. Who went to the Christchurch talk I gave? So you were bored stiff. I'm sorry, my apologies. I was going to apologise for giving the same talk, but it's all a time management thing. What with Fast Track, we have to move fast these days. So.